All right, thank you. Welcome everyone to our presentation today on what's new with Neo4j Bloom. This is Jeff Gagnon, Product Manager at Neo4j, and I'm Jessica Wright. I work in documentation at Neo4j.
Thank you, Jessica. So we've had a few IT glitches, but I think we're all set up now, so I'm going to try not to walk in front of the projector when I'm switching the slides. Thank you for joining us, and thank you for the intro, Jessica. So today we're going to talk about what's new with Neo4j Bloom, and I've been with Neo4j for about a year, so we're going to be stepping through the different versions that we've had over the past year. Just to have a quick look at the agenda, we're going to talk first a little bit about where Bloom fits into the Neo4j ecosystem. We saw a bit of that in the keynote today, if you attended that. And then we'll talk about basically an overview of Bloom. Jessica will take us through the user interface, and some of you may have used it. I don't know, maybe get a show of hands. How many people are familiar with Bloom already? Almost everybody, not everyone, all right. So for those of you who are already intimately familiar with the product, please bear with us if we're talking about things that are like sort of obvious to you, but we'll also make sure we highlight all of the stuff that we've worked on over the past year and make sure you haven't missed any of the great stuff that we've added in there. After that, we're going to really quickly go through all of the features that we've added, or at least some of the key features we've added in each new version of Bloom. We have a 2-month development cadence, so over the past year, we've released 6 different versions, and we'll talk about some of the key features in each. And then we'll sort of foreshadow some of the things we'll talk about in more detail about each of those key features that we want to really highlight and make sure people are aware of. I don't think we'll have time for questions, but you can feel free to reach out to myself or Jessica, jeff.gagnon@neo4j.com, excuse me, jessica.wright@neo4j.com. And yeah, we have some resources at the end of the presentation, so those are links. We think the presentation will be available after, but if not, again, you can reach out to us and we'll make sure you get those. So where does Bloom fit in? So of course we have the Neo4j graph database, which is this sort of picture on the left. And we have graph data science, which is a key component that brings the power of analytics, as we mentioned this morning, to the database itself. So those are very important. But also, we have a lot of other stuff in this growing ecosystem, one of which is the fact that Neo4j runs everywhere. We have Neo4j running in the cloud. We can run on self-managed hardware. We have Neo4j running in our Aura fully managed solution. We have Neo4j desktop that you can download and run yourself. We have all kinds of great stuff. We also have BI connectors. So we have JDBC and ODBC connectors that you can use with Bloom, connect to BI tools. We'll talk a little bit about how that works in conjunction with Bloom itself, sort of looking at drilling down into the details of the graph versus using BI tools like Power BI or Tableau. And of course, we have drivers that run with all kinds of different programming languages. We have the Cypher language. Of course, you're all quite familiar with that. How many people write Cypher? Everybody. So we'll talk about who Neo4j Bloom is for. We also cater to no-code and low-code use cases as well. So that's one of the unique features that we bring with Bloom. We have a host of developer tools. So we have, of course, Neo4j Browser. Everyone's familiar with that. We have GraphQL. We also have a host of user tools, and that would be, of course, Bloom and Neo4j Desktop, as well as the Ops Manager that was foreshadowed earlier today in the keynote speech as well. So we're here to talk about Bloom. We think of Bloom as the fastest path to graph data visualization. And what we're really trying to do with Bloom is make graphs make sense to more people. We want to bring the power of graph databases to people who don't necessarily write Cypher, people who aren't necessarily developers. So when we talk about the features that we've implemented in Bloom over the past year, these are folks who we really have front and center when we're thinking about what we want to do with the product. So this will come up again and again. We want Bloom to make graphs make sense to more people. So what do we mean? Who is it for? I've mentioned analysts a bunch of times here. Analysts are people who are specialists in their own domain. They might be specialists in money laundering, fraud. They could be working in the finance sector. They could be working in IT security. We really want Bloom to be domain agnostic, and we don't try to cater to any particular vertical or any particular domain or use case. We think that analysts are going to be, and currently are, our primary user base for Bloom. So most people who use Bloom are going to be analysts. Most people who use Bloom now are analysts. And again, these are people who really benefit from the no-code, low-code experience. That's not to say that developers aren't important. So a lot of you raised your hand. I think everybody that you write Cypher. That's great. Bloom is for developers too. And there are a couple of different ways that Bloom is for developers. One of them is to help analysts. So we have this concept of search phrases. How many people here have written a search phrase before? Not as many. Okay. So we'll talk about that feature in a bit of detail. We now refer to it as saved Cypher because we have two kinds of categories of search phrases as of Bloom 2.2. One is the classic search phrase that we've always had, and then the other one is also what we call scene actions. Developers can write these, and they can be very complex Cypher queries, and then analysts can use them from the near natural language search bar that we have in Bloom, or in the case of scene actions, from the context menu when you highlight and select nodes and relationships. So Bloom is for developers in that way, but Bloom is also for developers in that you can just use Bloom to get a sense of your data, to understand what's in the database, to see all of the different nodes and relationships, and think about how you might want to leverage those for the application you might be building. And finally, the data scientist. So we talked a lot this morning about graph data science and the power of a database that is good as a database and for analytics. And very similar to developers, data scientists can use Bloom to help analysts by building pipelines that generate results that analysts can then look at and action in Bloom without having to be data scientists or without having to be developers. But we can also help data scientists in the same way we help developers and analysts. They just want to have a look at the data, and with the new feature coming out hopefully next week in Bloom 2.3, they can even play around with different algorithms in a no-code, low-code way to see what they might want to do before they apply it to their entire graph using the Graph Data Science library, although we think that feature will be helpful directly for analysts as well. So those are the three primary user groups. And again, I'll say graphs make sense and are useful to more people. And the more people part here is really about that no-code, low-code experience. All right, so with that, I'll hand it over to Jessica, who will give us an overview of Bloom.
Thank you very much. And can I have the next slide, please? So I take it you're all a bit familiar with Bloom, but let's go over the main features. Bloom is a powerful graph visualization tool, and it aims to be intuitive, reliable, and useful to a variety of users, regardless of coding experience. It has 6 main components. In brief, perspective, that's where you can define a business view or domain within your graph that should be available for exploration. We'll have a closer look at the perspectives just shortly. Visualization. So the main idea of Bloom is to let you see your data, its nodes and relationships. And Bloom offers GPU-accelerated visualization with high-performance physics and rendering to do so. Exploration. Bloom lets you interact directly with your graph using only your mouse or your touchpad. You don't need any code there. But what you see in the scene is not necessarily what you get. So you can select elements, you can expand them, dismiss them, find paths between them, and so on. Inspection. Any visible element in the scene can be inspected to find more details about it. If it's a node, you can find its relationships, you can find its neighbors, and its properties, among other things. And then editing. So provided that you have write access to the graph, you can actually create new elements, you can edit and delete existing elements, all without writing any code at all. And last but not least is the search function. And that allows you to explore your data through graph patterns. There's still no code required. However, if you're familiar with Cypher, you can create custom Cypher queries, such as search phrases or scene actions. Again, these will be looked at a little bit closer later on. And the next slide, please. Perspectives. So as I mentioned previously, a perspective lets you control which elements from your graph that should be available for exploration. If you don't want all of your data, you can decide to include or exclude both node categories, as well as relationship types and their properties, to fully customize the perspective to suit your needs. You can also customize the default styling, such as the colors, sizes, icons of available elements in your perspective. And additionally, a perspective can be based on saved cipher, which is either a search phrase or a scene action. These will be explored in greater depth later, as I mentioned, but in brief, they're custom cipher statements that apply either to all of your data or the selected data in your scene. There are 3 types of perspectives. The auto perspective, which is fully automatic. And when you first connect to a new database using the basic access of Bloom, this is generated for you. And it's completely user transparent. When you open the perspective gallery, you have the option to generate a perspective, which is semi-automatic. And then the last option is a blank perspective that lets you fully create your perspective from scratch. But in all cases, as data is added to the scene, Bloom becomes aware of any additional properties. And let's have a look at the UI. So I'm not going to go over all the features here, just want to shine some light on some of them. So what you see here is the scene, and that contains the graph elements returned from your search or other actions such as expanding nodes. And on this side, there's the sidebar. On the very top is the perspective drawer, and that's where you define your perspective, as we just discussed. On the bottom is the settings drawer, the sidebar there. That contains options for the application, and from node query limit to property tooltips and case sensitivity and suggestions in the search bar. And down here, the card list. That shows information about all the elements in your scene. You can filter by selecting only relationships or only nodes, or you can double-click to expand to find more detailed information about any element. On the right-hand side is the legend panel, and that's where you can style the elements of your scene, including which captions should be visible for both nodes and relationships. And you can also apply rule-based styling from there, which is change the colors or sizes for both nodes and relationship based on a rule that you specify. Another interesting feature is the toggle here for the layout. So right now what you see is the physics layout, but some data sets, they can really benefit from a hierarchical layout, and you can just toggle that right down on the bottom. And then there's the option to export your scenes. If you find something interesting, you can click up on the top right corner there to export the visualization either as a screenshot or as CSV files. And this is another feature that Jeff will talk about a little bit later. And the next slide, please. So there are 2 different options for Bloom. There's the basic access and full access. Bloom Full Access requires a plugin and is currently only available for self-managed customers. Our enterprise customers should stay tuned for pilot opportunities in the future. One main difference is the sharing and authorization. So with full access, you can share perspectives and scenes to Neo4j roles. With basic, perspectives can only be shared by exporting and then re-importing it to a local client. Fine-grained access control to enterprise databases will still be respected by both versions of Bloom, however. And with that, over to you, Jeff, for Bloom features at a glance.
All right, thank you. So, yeah, we're going to go through this section pretty quickly, I think, because I'll talk in more detail about some of the other features, and we don't want everyone to get too bored with running through 6 different versions of Bloom over the past year. Welcome, newcomers. So, we'll start with Bloom 1.7, which was released a year ago this month in June 2021. And one of the things we introduced was the auto perspective. I won't be talking about this one later, so I'll just explain quickly what this is. We noticed that people would come into Bloom and they would see the perspective gallery, and they wouldn't necessarily know what to do with that if they'd never used Bloom before. So starting with this version of Bloom, we introduced a feature where if you're using a Bloom without the server plugin, so for example, if you're a new user and you're using Bloom in desktop, and you open Bloom on a new database, what you actually will get is the Bloom scene right away. You won't see the perspective gallery. So we're actually sampling one node of each type and some of the properties found on those, and providing that as the perspective to the Bloom user to provide a user experience that doesn't require learning what a perspective is before you can use Bloom for the first time. Now, once you've done that, you can then see the perspective gallery when you open that database again. And for our enterprise customers, we are actually showing the perspective gallery by default each time, because that is a key feature that allows you to have different business views of the graph that is used quite frequently with the Bloom server plugin. We also introduced the ability to reorder categories. Of course, nodes can have multiple labels, and Bloom uses the concept of a category when it's building the perspective. So in the perspective designer on the left-hand side, which most of you will be familiar with, you've got the list of different categories. Often we have a one-to-one mapping between the category and a node label. But if you use our classic example of the movies database, you've got maybe labels with person and actor labels, and you might have a category for each. And what should happen if you have a node with both labels? So Bloom lets you order the categories so that you can actually set a precedence for styling for the different categories when you have nodes with multiple labels. So that was a new feature that we introduced in this version. We also introduced support for the home database, which was new in Neo4j 4.3. So if you do have Neo4j 4.3 or above, your users have a home database, and Bloom will, by default, use that database in the perspective gallery and identify it with a home icon in the drop-down list of databases. So that was new as well. And of course, we did some UI improvements. So we actually have Sebastian Victorin, who's our UX designer who works on Bloom. And he's always giving us great ideas for what we can do to improve the UI. And in 1.7, we made some changes to the search phrase panel so that it auto-saves as you type, and you can resize where you put your cipher. And we made some other UI improvements as well, including to the card list and a few other things in this version. Then in Bloom 1.8, in August, we introduced SSO for custom solutions. So for our enterprise customers who had engaged Neo4j professional services to build a customized SSO solution for them before it was available in the product, we started supporting that in Bloom 1.8. We also introduced multi-user perspective editing. So if you're using the enterprise version of Bloom, Bloom Full Access, and multiple users are editing perspectives, then you can now get information about who changed the perspective and when. If you look in the perspective designer, there's a little book icon, and that will show you the user who changed the perspective and about how long ago they changed it, and you'll see those changes reflected in real time as you use a perspective. We also introduced the ability to export a screenshot. So we've heard lots about this feature, thank you. So you can currently export a screenshot of what's in view in your scene as a PNG file. We know people want to be able to do more. We know people want SVGs. We know people want to be able to include captions, even if they're zoomed out. So we're thinking about this, and stay tuned for more on this, but this was the first iteration of exporting a screenshot that we introduced in Bloom in this version. And we also had initial support for datetime types, and I'll go into detail about this a little bit later. We didn't fully cover time zones in version 1.8, but we did get to that in 2.1, and I'll have some more information about that as we continue with the presentation. Now I'll pass it to Jessica to take us through 1.9 and 2.0.
Thank you, Jeff. So October 2021, Bloom 1.9. First one there is tooltips and property captions. So when you hover over an element in the graph, the little box that pops up, that's the tooltip, and it's configurable, the property captions that are displayed inside. You can do that from the legend panel. Reveal relationships. There we go. So if you have some selected nodes in your scene, you can uncover additional relationships between them directly from the context menu. SSO for Neo4j Enterprise. So as Jeff mentioned in the previous version of Bloom, that one only included a custom SSO solution, but with 1.9, we offer support for SSO in Neo4j 4.4. And last but not least there, the documentation got a refresh. And then we fast forward to December of 2021 for the big Bloom 2.0 release, where we introduced scene saving and sharing. So much like how you sometimes need multiple tabs in your browser or multiple windows of your application, sometimes you need multiple scenes in Bloom to achieve your objective. Thank you. And you can save your current scene to return to it later. And any saved scene can be shared with other users of the same database, and you do so by selecting which Neo4j roles you want to share to. And this is an enterprise feature. Next one, histograms. And these are available to help you set values, both rule-based styling and filtering. And it's based on the values available in your scene and applicable to numerical properties. Then we had some editing enhancements. So in 2.0, you can create nodes even if that label has constraints, such as uniqueness for a certain property. If you try to create such a node, Bloom will prompt you to fill in all the necessary properties. And additionally, you can add properties to nodes, and you can also both delete and create new elements. But any editing requires write access to the graph, of course. Last one there is some layout improvements that allowed faster settling for smaller graphs. And back to you, Jeff.
Thank you. Okay, so that brings us to February. So we're almost through the year already. So Timezone support. Again, I'll talk about this again. I alluded to it in Bloom 1.8 that we added support for date time types, but we didn't include Timezone support. And we did in Bloom 2.1. And I'll talk about that. I have a slide all about time zones in just a few minutes. We also improved our error handling. So we did introduce a logging and error handling system in Bloom, which makes it possible to set error logging levels and to download logs. And you can even do this through the graphical user interface in the experimental settings pane. If you want to, there's a button that lets you download all logs. So this has been really helpful and will continue to be really helpful for our engineers as we aim to improve the overall stability and performance of the product to understand what goes wrong when things go wrong. So it's not really a feature for you directly, but indirectly it is. It's a feature for us, for you. And again, we did more UX improvements, so thank you, Sebastian. Color picker performance was improved. We did better handling of mapping categories to labels, and we introduced various bug fixes, which we're actually doing all the time. And we made some visualization improvements as well. So Jessica mentioned in Bloom 2.0 that we made it so that smaller graphs would settle more quickly. And the way that we did that was we introduced a library called Cytoscape for graphs under a certain size. And we found that some customers preferred the old way for how our graphs small graphs settled. So we have a switch now in the settings panel that was introduced in 2.1 that lets you choose whether you want to use the Cytoscape method or the classic physics method for doing this. And we're actually looking right now at what we're going to do about visualization and layout going forward. We probably want to change and make more intuitive the way that people select which layout they're using, because now we actually have three. We have the classic physics layout that works on all size graphs, the classic physics layout that uses Cytoscape for small graphs, and the hierarchical layout. And we're looking at adding additional types of layouts as well. So stay tuned for some updates to the UI around layouts. Now that takes us to Bloom 2.2, which is the most recent version of Bloom that's been released. We do have 2.3 coming out, hopefully next week. In 2.2, we introduced scene actions that I mentioned. It's an extension of search phrases, and it's found under what we call saved cipher now. So you have search phrases that are invoked from the near natural language search bar, or scene actions that are invoked from the context menu. And I'll talk a bit more about that in a couple of slides. We also redesigned our captions, which I'll talk about in another slide as well. But the big takeaway there is that you now have the ability to define what you want your relationships to have as captions from the properties. And again, more UX improvements, so multiple UI improvements and bug fixes as well. And finally, I think, no, sorry about this. All right, yeah, GDS integration. So I think you all saw this morning in the keynote, and I have a full slide devoted to that, so we won't go into it in detail just yet. So now let's think about some of those features that had the yellow plus signs. We'll talk about those in a little bit more detail. So scene saving and sharing is probably one of the biggest features that we've released in the past year. This feature is only available for Bloom Full Access Enterprise customers, so you do need the server plugin for it to work. But what it enables is the ability to save multiple scenes in your workspace. So users have their own list of scenes. They can save them and go back to them multiple days later, or they can have multiple scenes running to conduct a single analysis, whatever they need to do. So it's just basically like having different documents within Bloom that you can save and go back to. You also can share these scenes with other Bloom users via the database roles. So using the same dropdown that you use to export a screenshot or CSV, you can actually share your scenes to a database role, and anyone who has that role will see the scene that's been shared with them. We have a question. I'll try to take it quickly. Yep.
Is there a limit to how many you can have?
There is no limit to how many you can have built into Bloom, and we haven't encountered a limit. But what we have encountered is people have so many that there's no way to organize or search through them right now. And that's something we're looking at fixing. So that's actually a good problem to have. It means there are people who are using this feature quite a bit. So we're looking at that as sort of a next iteration for this feature. And I think that's all I really need to say about that. We're going to talk about search phrases just quickly here. I noticed only a few people raised their hand when I asked if you'd written them. This was not done in the last year. It existed before June 2021, but it's a foreshadowing for what I'm going to talk about with Saved Cipher, which is the next slide. So this is a powerful feature that lets your developers, or even your analysts if they want to, write Cipher and save it in the perspective, and then they can create a natural language expression. It can be parameterized, and an analyst or anyone can type that into the near natural language search bar in Bloom, and they can run that cipher on the graph and get results back in Bloom. So this is a way, again, to expose more low-code, no-code accessibility of the graph to a wider group of people thinking about making graphs more useful and make sense to more people. And these are saved with the perspective, so any user who uses the perspective can type in that phrase, and it can be relevant to whatever domain they're working in, again, IT security, fraud, money laundering, supply chain management, whatever the case may be. So we do see a lot of enterprise customers taking full advantage of this feature. Usually it's documented or demoed with fairly simplistic Cipher. But we see people using it with really complex Cipher, and we've even had to go in and make sure that things are running well if they're using APOC procedures, or even if they're doing writes to the database, which is something we didn't expect people to be doing with this. But that is something that you can do. We don't really limit what you do with this feature. So if you haven't used it, by all means, please feel free to try it out. So that brings us to Scene Actions, which was released in 2.2. And this is sort of an extension of the search phrases, in that rather than invoking them from the near natural language search bar, users can highlight one or multiple nodes and relationships. And when they right-click in the context menu, there's a new option there called Scene Action. And it'll list any scene actions that have been placed in the perspective, much like search phrases, except it's just invoked from a different place. What's really cool about this, though, is that you can use parameters on the selected nodes and relationships as input to your scene action. So you can actually write Cipher that will use different property values on the selection as input and provide results based on that. So again, if you haven't used it, try it out. Captions. So what do I want to say about captions? I mentioned the big thing that we've been asked for a long time, is you can now define what properties you see as captions on your relationships. We also moved where the captions are sort of configured and stored. It used to be in the perspective designer on the left-hand side of the UI. We moved it over into the legend panel, and in there you can configure sort of your default styling with your icons or the colors for different categories. And now there's another option there, which is text. So if you go into either a node or a relationship, you see that text option. Something else that's really cool about this feature is you can use it with rule-based styling. So you can set different captions for different different conditions in the scene for both nodes and relationships. Date time, I mentioned, is available sort of in 1.8 in a basic way without major time zone support, and then in 2.1, including time zone support. What we've done here is created what I think is a really powerful option, but it's a little bit of an innocuous feature. So here I'm showing the filter pane, and we have this red box that isn't really in the UI, but there's this button here I want to highlight called Translate Time Zone 2. So if you haven't played with this and you have time zone typed data in your data set, I would encourage you to try it out. If you click Translate Time Zone 2, you get a drop-down box that has all of the possible time offsets in the world, and you can select one. In this case, we have Z selected, which is Greenwich Mean Time. And how would you use this? Well, imagine that you have a data set of NetFlow data for servers, and you're doing some kind of IT security work for an enterprise that has servers in multiple different regions around the world. And you might be interested in looking only at flows that happen before business hours, regardless of what time zone the server was in. So you could set your filter to be before 9 a.m., and you would see relationships representing flows that happen before 9 a.m. without considering the time zone at all. Something else you might want to do if you have that kind of data is imagine you have an incident that occurs at 2 p.m. British time, GMT, with some server in your organization. What you want to do is see all of the flows that happened around that time, but all of your flows are in different time zones. So how would you do that? Well, you could reprocess your data and write it back to the database in a normalized time zone, but that would take a lot of work, and it's not conducive to no code, low code. So you click this button, you pick the time zone you're interested in, and you say between, say, 1:55 and 2:05, and you will see relationships that happen between 1:55 and 2:05 in the time zone that you selected for translating time zones to. This doesn't change anything in the database. It's relative only to the current Bloom scene, but it's a powerful way for analysts to actually think about things in time zones in a way that's a little bit more useful than actually having to go and reprocess data to look for things that happened at a certain time. And finally, I will leave you with GDS integration. So again, stay tuned for this next week, hopefully with Bloom 2.3, assuming everything goes to plan. And this was mentioned this morning at the keynote as well. And what you can do is load a scene and then apply algorithms directly to the data. Much like the time zone translation feature, we don't write anything to the database with this feature. So it's intended for analysts who maybe would never use GDS at the command line, or maybe for data scientists who aren't sure what algorithms they might want to run. And they can try different things out on a small amount of data and then go back and process the larger graph according to what they've sort of tinkered around with using this feature. So we're really excited about this. At first, when we launch, we're only going to have 4 algorithms available. We have some criteria around the algorithms that we include with this feature. Namely, they have to be performant on graphs of 10,000 nodes or less. Why 10,000? That's the limit currently for Bloom in terms of how many nodes you can show. It has to be a production level GDSL algorithm. So if you're familiar with the library, we have alpha, beta, and production level algorithms. So you'll only see production level algorithms in Bloom. And lastly, the algorithms have to lend themselves well to visualization. So something where sizing a node or coloring a node kind of makes sense to do. So keeping those 3 criteria in mind, and also wanting to start with a relatively small subset so that it's not too overwhelming and we can learn how people are using it. If people are using it, learn more about the feature and how it's useful. The ones that we should launch with next week are degree centrality, betweenness, so 2 centrality algorithms, and then 2 community algorithms. It'll be weakly connected components and Louvain. So when that feature does launch, please do download Bloom 2.3 and play around with it. Let us know what you think. Thank you again. All right, and finally, I'll hand it back to Jessica to bring us to an end before our next presenters show up.
All right, thank you, Jeff. So we're reaching the end of our presentation. To summarize, today we have seen where Bloom fits into the Neo4j ecosystem of products and who its main users are. We walked through an overview of Bloom and had a closer look at perspectives and the UI. And then we learned some basic differences between basic and full access to Bloom. We've seen some highlights from the releases of the past year. It's been a feature-packed year. And then Jeff walked us through some of the most important and widely anticipated features. We get a preview of the exciting GDS integration in Bloom, which will be available in the upcoming release due next week. If you want to see more, join us along with Sebastian, our UX designer, tomorrow for our workshop at 1 p.m. Discovery and Insights with Graph Visualization using Neo4j Bloom. It's going to be interactive and lots of fun. We have some additional resources, and as Jeff mentioned earlier, I would think that all the slides will be available after the conference. If not, feel free to reach out to us and we'll share with you. And with that, thank you very much for your time and your attention. And if you have any questions, I think we have about 2 minutes.